Hello and welcome to our second podcast for the week. So earlier this week, we're in week 2 of our journey through Acts 40 through 66. Earlier in this week, we looked at verses 9 through 15. And so today we want to begin with verse 16 to go a little bit further into Isaiah chapter 40. We won't finish Isaiah 40 today, but hopefully we'll get toward verse 20, somewhere in there, maybe 22. Okay, well, where did we leave off? Or where did Isaiah leave off? We left off with verse 13, with verse 14, but the last few verses of the lead up, who has directed the Spirit of Yahweh, the Ruach Yahweh? Who has directed him? Who is his counselor? Who instructed him? Who showed him understanding? All the nations are like a drop in the bucket on his scales. He lifts up the isles. Okay, now here's where we get to verse 16. The isles are a very small thing. So verse 16 continues. Lebanon, there is not enough in Lebanon to burn, and its beasts, there are not enough for a whole burnt offering. So what I take this to be saying in verse 16 is, even if you took the whole city of Lebanon, which I assume must have been a fairly big city in the late 500s. I didn't do my homework, but I'm guessing that if Lebanon is being mentioned here, then it must be a fairly large city. And of course, this is outside of Israel to the north, more in the area of Syria, I would say, to the north. And basically, I assume that in the late 5th century, Lebanon was big. But that's not enough. You could take, so today we would say New York City or Chicago. Even if you were to offer up all of New York City or Mexico City, I hear is the largest city in the world, or at least was at one point in the not too distant past. So take all of Lebanon and offer it up as a sacrifice. That's not enough to be the sacrifice that God merits. Now, I grew up in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, which is a continuous city, but it's not a very, or at least when I was growing up, it wasn't a very congested city. It was a fairly leisurely city. A lot of the cities down there along the coast don't have a lot of high buildings and so forth. And from there, I went to Southern Wesleyan in South Carolina, and then I went to Wilmore, Kentucky, near Lexington. So it was while I was there in seminary that I first visited Chicago. And man, to me, Chicago was a massive city. I'd never been in a city like Chicago. And so when I imagine the feeling I had when I first visited Chicago is maybe a little bit, my guess is, what Lebanon was like at the time in the late 500s. And so this must have been an awesome kind of comment. You know, take all Lebanon, offer it as a whole burnt offering. That's not enough. The greatness of God, that would not be sufficient. I don't think we want to push the metaphor too far. I think the point of the metaphor is how great God is and what He merits in comparison. Okay, verse 17. All the nations are as nothing before Him, and less than nothing, and worthless they are counted by Him. So basically, the whole earth is not enough for the greatness of God. By the word worthless here is tohu. I don't know if you remember in Genesis 1 where it says, and the earth was formless and void. Tohu vavohu. This is tohu here. Formless, there is often the translation in Genesis. Basically, the whole world is just a messy chaos in comparison to God. Verse 18, let's continue. And then, whom will you liken God? Here it's the short form of God, El. It's not Elohim even. It's not the name of God. It's a short form here. To whom will you liken El? To whom will you liken God? Or what is like what likeness will you compare to him? I'm looking at some of the forms here that remind me of the image and likeness of God in verse in Genesis. But anyway, the verb forms of them. Who will you liken God? What is the likeness to him? Now, in verse 19, we're going to go off into something that is a part of the themes of this section of Isaiah, and that is against idolatry. Isaiah, especially when we get to like chapter 45, the monotheism of God, that there's one true God, is a major theme of this stretch of Isaiah. And so in keeping with that emphasis upon the one true God, we're going to see here a lambasting of those who would worship idols. And so verse 19 begins that. A workman molds an image, and a goldsmith with gold overspreads that image, and casts chains of silver. So we're talking about idol making here. You start with some kind of a base, maybe a wooden base, and then you overlay it with gold or silver. And ta-da, we've got an idol. Verse 20. Who is impoverished for such a contribution? A tree that will not rot. So we're going to start with that piece of wood to make the idol. A workman chooses a tree that will not rot, and to make the base of that idol. And so he seeks. So a person. Okay. So this is talking about the poor person's idol now. So the person who can't afford the gold and silver, the one who's too impoverished for such a contribution, he picks a tree that won't rot, so gets a good piece of wood. He seeks a skillful workman for himself to prepare a carved image that won't totter. So this is the poor man's idol here. We have an idol for every economic, bracket. Have you not known? Have you not heard? Has it not been told from the beginning to y'all? Have you not understood from the foundations of the earth? Okay, so now we're going to get a lesson. That's not a God. That's not. Now, of course, I think the more sophisticated of the ancients probably didn't see the piece of wood or the gold as the God. They saw it as a kind of a representation of the God that they were worshiping. So, in fact, this was a common pushback from the more sophisticated pagans of the ancient world when Jews or Christians would basically say, "What are you, stupid? Worshipping a piece of wood?" The typical comeback was, "Well, we're not actually worshiping the wood. We're worshiping the God represented by the wood." Now, whether or not that was the case in the ordinary person often doesn't quite follow the way of thinking of the sophisticated theologian. For example, in the Roman Catholic Church, in the Roman Catholic Church, a Roman Catholic theologian would tell you that it is inappropriate to worship Mary. Official Roman Catholic does not believe in worshiping Mary. They believe in venerating saints and venerating Mary. And there's a technical distinction among Roman Catholic theologians on those sorts of things. But the question is, what happens in ordinary practice? What happens in the ordinary Roman Catholic home? Now, I don't know. I'm not going to sit here and pretend like I am an expert on that sort of thing. But what I'm getting at here is that it's possible, at least, that's a little bit of a blurriness happens between veneration and worship on a popular level. Could happen. But the same thing you could argue can happen with people with the Bible. Rather than the Bible pointing you to God, that the Bible could become an end in and of itself for some people, maybe. Who knows? But basically, Isaiah is mocking the idea that you would confuse that piece of wood or silver or gold with the real God. Have you not heard? Has it not been told you from the beginning? Have you not understood from the foundations of the earth? You know, that piece of wood didn't make the earth. I guarantee you that. Here we get to it, verse 22. Here's the verse. The verse of, if I were going into the Hebrew of this, and I think probably next week we'll move on. But here we get verse 22. The one who sits above the circle of the earth, and to whom its inhabitants are like grasshoppers. The one who stretches out the heavens like a curtain, spreads them out to dwell in like a tent. He brings princes to nothing, and the judges of the earth he makes useless. Scarcely shall they be planted. Scarcely shall they be sown. Scarcely shall something in the earth take root. When their stock comes, he blows them, and they wither upon them. And the whirlwind, like stubble, takes them away. And then, of course, verse 25. And to whom will you liken me? To whom will you equate me? Says the Holy One. So the point here is that God is not like these, kind of embarrassingly minuscule and impoverished things like a piece of wood or even gold and silver. That the true God, the one true God, is not to be found on earth, any earthly thing or in any earthly thing, but rather the true God from the foundation of the earth sits above the circle of the earth. And we're like little grasshoppers, next to him, like little ants, we would say today, maybe. And this is the guy who spreads the heavens out like a curtain. And here I'm picturing a shower curtain, that you when you get out of the shower, and you close the curtain, and you draw them out. God does that every morning it's time to stretch out the skies. It's morning, and God stretches out the skies for us. I will say that probably the picture here is the ancient picture, not a modern picture, which makes perfect sense, right? We would not expect God to reveal himself in our terms. We would expect him to give pictures to them that fit their terms. So, for example, when we see the circle of the earth here, we assume a globe, but it's not at all clear that this is a three-dimensional circle or a sphere that's being talked about here. This is probably a disk, as is often said, a disk that sits upon chaotic waters. And that's probably the way Isaiah would have, or whoever the author of this section of Isaiah is, how they would have pictured it. They would have pictured it. I'm not saying for sure. If you can show me otherwise, I'll say, oh, well, I was wrong. But I think most would say that this is a disk that sits upon the waters. That if you would ask Isaiah or someone from the 6th century to draw the universe, that's how that they would have drawn the picture here. So it's an exercise on how we read and we use the Bible as a mirror. We see in the Bible ourselves and our own assumptions, but without even knowing it most of the time. But of course, if we want to listen to the text inductively, we want to hear it on the terms that it was understood. What was in the bubble above the author's head as God revealed to him? I assume it's probably him, just given the male bias of the ancient world. Although there were female prophets, right? Huldah was the number one spiritual authority in Israel in the late 600s. Well, okay, this has been, so we'll call it, I went through verse 25, but we'll start again with verse 25 next week, Lord willing. Again, what is the point of these verses? It is the greatness of our God. And my favorite verse of this stretch is verse 22. It is he who sits above the circle of the earth, and to him his inhabitants are like grasshoppers. He stretches out the skies like a curtain and spreads them out like a tent to dwell in. That's the guy you're messing with here, or more appropriately, that's the God that we worship. That's the God that Israel worships. Well, this has been Isaiah verse 16 through 24, 25.